Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In this episode, I'm joined by Tricia Levenseller, author of The Shadows Between Us. It's a young adult fantasy novel that's been quite accurately described as a Slytherin romance. It follows the charming and cunning Alessandra, the second daughter of mid-level nobility, for years left to pursue her own lusts and liaisons while her favorite older sister awaited a suitor. Now of age and availability to be brought to society, Alessandra has her sights set on a singular target, the elusive and mysterious Shadow King, a young ruler wrapped in living darkness. But Alessandra doesn't just seek courtship, she desires nothing less than the throne and total control, and she intends to steal the heart of the king and then kill him so she'll have the throne all to herself. Because she isn't just a confident and conniving would-be queen, she's a murderer who's killed her first love when he scorned her. But she's not the only person at court who wants to assassinate the Shadow King, and winning his true affections is an entirely complicated matter on its own. The Shadows Between Us is available in stores now from Fywell & Friends, a division of Macmillan. And Tricia, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So the copy that's on the back of the book is much more concise. And the Slytherin romance thing ties up the idea pretty well, I think.
I think so.
But what did I miss? What else thematically would you talk about with this story?
No, you nailed it. Literally, all I tell people is it's about a girl who sets out to woo, wed, and kill the Shadow King so she can take everything he has for herself. That's all I say. So you went into all the details. You made me almost want to reread it, even though I've read it so many times, you know? So, no, you totally nailed it. I feel like you got all the important parts across.
Well, good.
Yeah.
Fiction is such a difficult thing to sum up. And when you're trying to get the relevant details down so people can get it. And of course, this is missing 350 other characters and important relationships and, loads of context. But we're going to get to all that stuff. So it'll be good. Of
course. Yeah.
You were recognizable to YA fans with, I'm going to botch the title, the Pirate's Daughter.
Daughter of the Pirate King.
Daughter of the Pirate King. Oh my gosh, I should.
It's okay. I've heard anything in between there, so it's all good. There's nothing I haven't heard before. Everyone gets it all wrong.
I literally own the book. Well, I should say my wife owns the book. She bought it, and it is on her bedside table. And
I love that.
But we do have that handy. I know that was a duology, and then you have another novel.
Another standalone fantasy, Warrior of the Wild.
Warrior of the Wild, yeah, and this is a standalone as well.
It is.
And that seems like kind of a rarity in the current market to actually just do a one and done story. Is that something when approaching the publisher where you're like, hey, I've got a fantasy thing and just a standalone novel? Are they like, oh, great? Or are they like, we really like epic quests and 35 novel long series?
No, that's a great question. Actually, they prefer short and sweet. And here's why. Publishing is so uncertain in so many ways, right? You never know how something's going to do until it's out there and people are seeing how well it does. And buying a standalone novel is less of a risk than buying a whole series, right? Because when publishers buy an idea from you, they'll buy the whole series or they'll buy just the book, right? So just doing a standalone, it's one and done. And here's the thing. If you do a big, long series, you lose readers with every concurring book in the series because, people aren't going to buy book 3 if they haven't read book 2 and book 1 and enjoyed it, right? So it's actually a lot easier to sell standalones than it is a big series. That being said, I feel like YA fantasy readers are here for the trilogies, right? They love their trilogies. So everybody thinks oh, that's what I need to write when I try to break into publishing. Daughter of the Pirate King, I actually tried to pitch that as a trilogy. And they're like, well, we'd actually just like to do a duology. So I had to condense it into 2 books because I was a brand new author, back then. So they wanted to just see how I do to start out, right? But for me, I don't try for a standalone or for a big series. It's really just how the idea comes to me, And for Daughter of the Pirate King, this is a bigger thing. Obviously, this needs more books. And for Warrior and for Shadows, they both came to me as singular ideas that I could be, over and done with in one book. So it really just depends on how the idea comes to you. But it's actually a lot easier to sell a standalone than it is a series right now.
Well, I got to tell you, as a reader and a podcaster and a reviewer, I get really excited at a handful of phrases. One is standalone novel, one is novella, and the other one is fast, short read, essentially.
Yes.
And one of the things I appreciated when this book came to my hands is that, one, it's relatively concise. It is not a massive volume. and two, that it really moves at speed. And we'll talk about pacing a little bit more in it, but that was one of the things where I feel like in my own experience reading it, and then also, I glanced at some of the reviews online and stuff. And what a lot of people said was that they sat down to read the first chapter and read 5, and then were like, whoa, because it gets up and moves. It's the POV of the main character, and the fact that it's dialogue heavy, especially nobody would be able to see this, but you can't see this. There's a shelf over here on the side that's my to read shelf.
Oh, I have one of those, except mine's a bookcase.
Yeah, well, the bookcase is in the other room with that too, but this is just the to read shelf just for the show. And there are a number of books on there. There are these huge doorstopper things that are crazy large. Every time I look at them, I almost shudder because I'm like, oh God, I'm a relatively quick reader, but not at the speed that there are some consumers that just plow through books at an amazing rate. And I am not that person. But particularly in prepping for the show, I'm always like, tight and concise and standalone is so exciting because like you said, when somebody shows up and they're like, oh, it's the 7th book in a series that's been out, how do you even start that? How do you jump into it? I don't have that time.
No. I think that's just my writing style. If I'm going off in a billion directions and if I'm taking lots of time to describe the scenery or whatever, I get bored. I have a very short attention span, so I think it's just part of me and the way I have to write in order to actually enjoy my writing process. Otherwise, I get bored. So my novels tend to be very concise and don't go in a bunch of different directions. They are things you can just sit down and read. And I like it that way, I don't think every book needs to be a big, intense, epic thing. I love that we have books like that because we need lots of diversity. But it's just not my style.
Well, and that leads me to talk about the world building in this a bit. So like I said, this is a fantasy novel, but the fantasy is not really front and center in it. I mean,
it's not.
The Shadow King is himself, he has this magical element about him. I find it kind of amusing that it is not very much the focus of the people around him. It is just sort of a thing that you see it the first time, you're like, oh, that's weird. And then you watch him a little time and you're like, that's neat. And after a while, everybody just sort of accepts it as just the normal part of every day. Right. Like, he's the Shadow King. He's got shadow stuff. I don't know, man. That's how it works, right? On one level, you want to be like, oh, it'd be so strange. And on another level, you're like, in real life, we get used to anything if we're exposed to it long enough. And it makes sense that all of these people who are hanging out in the court of the king would eventually just sort of take it for granted that, I don't know, he's that weird guy that has living shadow. I don't know, man. It just happens, right? You were talking about how you don't like to lose yourself in the overall big details or going off a lot of crazy directions. And again, in the sort of laser focus of this story, I felt like you kept through the POV of Alessandra because it is a first person narrative and it's first person present.
Yes, it is.
Which is something that didn't even occur to me until I was 3 chapters in and I was like, oh, wait, this is present tense. Okay. Which is something I'm seeing happen a little bit more often these days.
Oh, yeah.
And which is probably why it doesn't throw me, because it used to be, it would be my brain would spin out of control. Like, what is happening here?
I think once Hunger Games came out, present tense just became a thing. And everyone was like, yeah, let's try it because Hunger Games did it so well.
I think it's interesting you bring up Hunger Games here because, while there's not any parallels between those stories in this at all, but there is something that I think is interesting that I thought about with that novel while I was reading this, which is that when you have a first-person POV, you can really kind of go one of two ways. You can either have a character that really has an almost omniscient kind of view of the world in the sense that they're giving you just every bit of information about what's, whether it's the world building or the history or, they seem to kind of know everything. Mm-hmm. Or you have characters that are really only telling you exactly what they feel and experience themselves, and they don't care much about the outside stuff. With Katniss in Hunger Games, I always felt like that character was the latter, where she's really only giving you just as much of the world as you need. And Katniss is kind of a flat narrator. She's rather unemotive, at least through kind of the first book. And at times, I felt like I almost disconnected from the narrative a little bit because I kind of wanted I wanted a character who was a little more enthusiastic about their world. Alessandra in this is the opposite in the sense that she's very, very enthusiastic about the things that are going around her, or at least very interested. But we are really getting a narrative tailored to her taste. At least that's how it feels to me. The things she's interested in are the things that we spend time in the details with. We get a good sense of the clothing, of how people look, how they present themselves, the meals that are brought to the table, the decor of the places that she's living in. But there's oftentimes when people will talk about greater history of the world, even really recent history, and she's kind of clueless about it. And it's presented in I don't know, I was young, I didn't care kind of way. So I kind of want to know I mean, I guess this is both a POV and a world building kind of question, but in constructing the narrative around that POV, was that really an intentional thing? Like you said, like having your own kind of laser focus in on that world? Is it something that came from Alessandra herself as you were constructing that character? How do you use her as a lens to build that world around her?
I've never actually thought about it in this way, but I definitely created Alessandra first and thought about what's most important to her and what she's going to notice when she first walks into a room, right? That's something that I do with my characters. When they walk into a new space, what's going to be of the most interest to them, right? And for Alessandra, it's definitely what are people wearing? What do they look like? What are the pretty things on the walls? Because that's just the way she is. So I definitely wrote the novel to her experience and what she would notice and what she would be doing. It's very different for like my other characters. I don't know if you had a chance to read Warrior of the Wild, but Rosmira does not care very much about clothing or anything like that. She likes pretty things, but she's more like, oh, that weapon's really cool. Let me look at those details on that axe or whatever, right? So once you know what's important to your character, it really just kind of drives where their eyes go in every scene and what they're interested in talking about. And so I feel like once you really know that, you can build the narrative around that. And that's kind of the approach I take.
When you have a character who is extremely perceptive about other people, she's not empathetic per se.
No. Definitely not.
But she's good at sort of like rooting out their motivations, their reactions, to a certain extent, predicting how they will act. It doesn't always work out, and occasionally she gets burned a bit when a few of the characters act in ways, especially like a former lover who shows up on the scene in order to cause some trouble, and she's clearly not thought that far ahead in her game of mental chess and throws things awry for a while. But yeah, I like that point of view a lot. I think it's worth noting that like when we say like Slytherin romance here, like this main character is kind of the villain of the piece, you know?
She is.
Yeah, not just that she wants to kill somebody and that she has killed somebody. And I mean, and that's no secret. I mean, the book starts with, so this is how I killed my lover when I was like 16. Right off the bat, we're like, oh, it's going to be that kind of thing.
Yeah.
When you're putting somebody together like this, I mean, she's often confrontational. She's very strong-willed. She certainly isn't moral in any way we would normally think of. She's somebody coming from sort of mid-level privilege and easily adjusting to high-level privilege. And she's pretty disparaging. Like there's another character who's a total bore of a guy, but he spends a lot of his time talking about how much money he gives to charity. And it's very, very self-serving. But Alessandra is not interested in charity and is not interested in the welfare of the peasants. So in constructing a character who is your lead, I mean, sometimes people talk about like unlikable characters and that can be tough. And Alessandra is quite likable in her own way because she's very entertaining and sometimes laugh out loud funny. Some of the like moments in the novel where we're getting observations from her are really funny, but she's not a good person. So how do you keep that as your POV and make that function over the length of a novel?
Yeah, it was super tricky. I knew going into it to have a character like this that is quote unquote unlikable, people would still need to have reasons to like her to keep reading, right? Otherwise, they're going to put the book down. And there's a variety of ways that I did this. So one thing you can do is to make characters really, really good at something. So take a look at like Sherlock Holmes from BBC's Sherlock, right? He is super annoying and he's kind of a horrible human being, actually, but we love him because he's so good at what he does. And watching him do what he's good at is absolutely fascinating. So we love the show and him as a character. Anyway, for Alessandra, it's her sewing skills. It's setting her trends at fashion. It's the things that she's really, really good at and excels at. And we like seeing her excel in that area. The other thing is giving characters vulnerability. So for her, her mom died when she was young and she was ignored for so long, didn't get to go to any of the parties until her older sister was finally engaged. So she has a little bit of that vulnerability that makes us go, aw, poor her, right? And just having that little bit makes people sympathize with your character more. But the biggest thing is definitely relatability. And when I set out to make Alessandra, I asked myself, what can I do to her overall character that will help people understand her a little bit? And what I decided was everyone's been dumped, right? Everybody knows what that's like. Everyone knows what that feels like. And it's horrible and it hurts, right? Alessandra is just the person who grabbed the nearest pointy object and shoved it into that person's chest so that, he would go away and not be a problem anymore. So even if you don't agree with the way she handled it, you can be like, oh, yeah, I've been there. I felt that. That sucks, right? So just doing those little things to kind of make her more relatable and more likable, even though she's not really a good person. I feel that kind of tricks you into liking her anyway and wanting to see how her story progresses.
You said that this story really started with her as a character. Can you walk through kind of like what that original genesis was and then like how the story developed around that idea?
Sure. So it started with this ambitious girl who just wanted the world, right? She wanted to have everything, which meant that she needed to start with not having everything, right? Which is where I decided, okay, let's start her with second youngest daughter of a minor nobleman. She's ignored by everyone because of these stupid societal rules. And here's where she wants to get to, right? So I like to start with the beginning and I like to start with the end, right? That I have in mind. From there, it was coming up with that backstory. It was that idea of being dumped and killing that first boy. And once I knew that, it was like everything else fell into place. Because once I knew what lines she was willing to cross, I could tell what decision she would make in the moment. Because it's like, all right, she's already killed. She doesn't mind killing again. When this past lover comes back, Myron comes into the story, like, you know she'll kill him if she can, right? If she can get away with it. You know what line she can cross, but she has to be more careful, right? To keep scrutiny off her. So she can't just do the same thing over and over again. But I feel like really knowing those lines helps me know where she's going to go in different directions. And once I got to court, I realized that she was going to make friends. I really hate it when there's this instant, like, female-female, like, antagonizing relationships. There's these instant, like, dislike of other female characters because there's, like, some weird competition between how they look or what they're after. They want the same thing or something. And I've always thought that was kind of dumb because in my experience, real women aren't like that. We don't automatically fight because we want the same thing or whatever. That's just never been my experience. So it was really important to me to show, no, these are women who all want to, find happy marriages and who want to be, have high standings, and they're going to empower each other and bring each other up. And that's kind of how her two friends just kind of naturally came into the story and evolved from there. So yeah, I don't know. Once I had those down, I feel like everything else just kind of came into place. The other thing that I did think of ahead of time was the murder mystery element, right? So aside from the romance, which is the main plot, there's this idea that somebody killed the past Shadow King and Queen, and someone is now trying to kill the current Shadow King, her love interest, Callias. So I had to figure that out. And that was really hard because I've never had to plot something out like that before. And you want that to feel original and unique because, the butler did it isn't very clever, right? You've got to really dig deep and try to find something fun that people aren't going to see coming. So that was the other thing that I had to plan out and kind of thread into it as I went along. But once I had that, it just kind of, I don't know, it flowed. It's the fastest novel I've ever written. It took me about 4 months. And I don't think I'll ever be able to do that again. But I don't know. It just flowed once I figured her out.
I like that you mentioned like when she meets her friends at court, because we know that Alessandra does not have a lot of female friends in her life. But she recognizes the utility of it. And so she just approaches a couple and it just happens. And then being as somebody who kind of lives on the comic convention circuit, I don't know how many times I have just been in a random place and somebody will come up and be like, hey, there's an open chair. Can I sit here? And then they've been friends for like the last 3 years, because people have just walked in. And I feel like that is, at least if you are not an intensely antagonistic person, that is more how life goes when you're just put into social situations. You do find yourself aligned quickly with people because you have to be. I think it's a tribal nature kind of thing for ourselves. We need to find that companionship. I think some of the things that struck me with this novel that were interesting were that there's a dichotomy between the fact that you have kind of traditional ideas of courtside as far as like fathers are marrying off daughters for a bride price, and the women don't necessarily get a lot of say in that. And sometimes the men don't get a lot of say in that either, because one of your supporting characters is stuck in a forced betrothal. And certainly some of the gender roles are a little off balance. But at the same time, this is a diverse world where there's a lot of people of different colors. It is also I'm trying to think, there's a word for this and I can't think of what it is, but basically like it is a sexually open world in the sense that gay, straight or bi or whatever, none of that is an issue in any situation. Now, it's clearly not totally sex positive because they're pretty uptight about what a young lady can get up to in her bedroom, which is a problem for Alessandra because she definitely likes to get up to it, which is a little bit of a sticking point for her sometimes. But yeah, like when you were putting that together, I feel like in a novel like this, a lot of the audience who are going to come to it are probably versed, at least to some degree, in sort of similar kind of courtship, kind of romance stuff. And maybe not every like YA audience person is going to come in with that, but I feel like it will be at least somewhat familiar to them. So when you're working alongside with things that an audience recognizes, but subverting some of those tropes at the same time, like how much of that is a conscious decision? How much of it is something that you had to like work around or figure out like, oh, I need to lay out these ground rules, or, did you have any issues putting that together?
I don't think so. So at the time I was reading a lot of Regency romances, which is probably what heavily influenced the setting and the scenery of this novel. And just the idea of, the monarchy and, the dukes and the caste system and everything kind of came from that. And I just kind of assume that people can figure it out. Even if you've never read a Regency romance novel or aren't very familiar with history, you can kind of pick that up. And the great thing about writing alternate world history, which is what I write, is that I can make up my own norms in a society. And I love that. I love that I can just write a story where people have whatever sexual orientation and people can just go along with it. It's just accepted as part of the world, because that's not always the case in our world. And I love creating worlds where people are better to each other and don't even have those issues. Similarly, with the female sexuality, that was actually a conscious decision I also made. I made a point of having, Alessandra, who's obviously very sex positive. And then we've got her friend Rhoda, who only sleeps with the men that she's in love with or that she was forced to marry, right? And then you have her friend Hestia, who's saving herself for marriage. And it was super important to me to just show these different women and show that they all had different opinions about sex and marriage and their choices, but that all were okay and that women can do whatever they want with their bodies. And that was a very conscious decision. I'm not trying to make a statement about how much sex people should have or what should they be doing or anything like that. It was really just a matter of being like, this is your body. This is your choice. No one else should be able to tell you what you can or can't do with it. And so that was something I definitely wanted to bring to the forefront, because I feel like today, that's not necessarily a norm. Men are called studs, whereas women are called sluts, right? And women who aren't sluts are prudes. It's like, it's bad no matter what, right? So it was just really important to me to talk about that and bring that up as kind of a light background thing, to show kind of the norms. And then Alessandra be like, no, we're going to change this because this is ridiculous. And I'm going to be in charge soon, so I might as well just start making decisions now, right? So it was just like a fun added bonus as she's like going through court and making changes and doing all this stuff. Definitely was all intentional. And I just assume that readers can, pick up where I'm going and just roll with it. And if it works for them, great.
You said that this was the fastest novel that you'd ever written. What was your writing process for it? Did you outline? Did you just seat of your pants? Combination? How'd it work?
Funnily enough, I pants this one. I'm usually a heavy outliner. I do chapter by chapter what I'm going to write, what I'm going to do. And I feel good about that because I know if I can write a whole outline, I can write a whole book. But whenever I do that, I always discovery write my romances because I feel like I have to be in there in the moment to kind of be there as the relationship develops. The problem is when you write a book where the main conflict is the romance, suddenly I'm having to discovery write the whole book, which is what I had to do for this one. But for some reason, it went faster. I don't know why. It's the longest of all my published books. So it wasn't that the book's shorter. It's definitely just that, I don't know, it flowed more. I really enjoy writing romance. So I think maybe there was a little bit more fun involved. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was just sitting down every day and feeling where I was at and then going, and it just going off of instinct rather than like a written out plan or something. For whatever reason, it worked. But it was definitely a different experience than my other novels.
Like you said, it's focused on romance, so it probably makes sense for us to spend a little bit of time talking about the object of her not initially legitimate affections, the Shadow King.
Yeah.
And that's a very grandiose name for him. He fits into a bit of a tradition in the YA space of the darkly brooding, grumpy fellow.
I know. I'm a sucker for it. I love it. I couldn't help it. It's my bad.
Thankfully, my feeling, as much as this is an extremely ambitious, he's 19, but he's off on his way to being a conquering king. But he doesn't feel, at least to me, as toxic as, say, like a Darkling or something like that.
That's awesome. For the record, I love the Darkling. But yeah, the goal is that even if you're not expecting a happily ever after or whatever when you read this story, I'm not saying whether or not there is one. I wanted there to be the possibility of one, which meant that these characters had to be well matched and also likable so that you could root for that if that's your kind of thing.
So tell me more about the Shadow King. And his name is Callias, And that's a thing that a lot of people at court seem not to know. Like he's like a sort of a formal title, and first names are a very intimate thing within this world. Like you don't call somebody that, by that unless you are friends, and people are more careful and formal about how they address things. So even the king revealing that name to her once she quite nefariously catches his eye is definitely an intimate thing. So what can you kind of tell me about him as a character, and then maybe elaborate a little bit on this shadow stuff, because I did not find it in my vocabulary to adequately explain what that was.
Okay. So poor Callias lost his parents a year ago. They were both murdered, and he's had several attempts on his life already. And what he's done is he's narrowed it down to the people who are in court right now. Those were the people who were in the palace the night his parents were killed. So he knows it's one of them. So it's kind of a keeping your enemies close kind of situation. Everyone who was there that night is forced to stay in the palace until he figures out who did it. But nobody knows that he's looking into it, right? So when Alessandra comes, who obviously wasn't there the night his parents died, he finds a little bit of an ally in her. And he's like, hey, I need to put up this pretense because he's getting pressure from his counselors to marry and produce an heir, because if he dies, there's no one else to take over, right? So they're trying to get him to create an heir, and he's like, no, I'm trying to root out my parents' murderer. So, hey, let's fake court. And I did the fake dating trope because I love that one too, and it couldn't be helped. So they're fake dating just to get the council off his back while he looks into who killed his parents. And he's pushed away all his friends and anyone who's ever close to him because anybody could be in on it. And he just doesn't trust anyone anymore. So he has to become a little bit vulnerable and finally let this girl get close to him in some ways, just so that he can continue to function and figure out what's going on. He has to have allies because he obviously can't do it by himself. And creating Callias was, I don't know, it was a little challenging in some ways because it's hard to create a compelling character who can't really interact with a ton of people, right? Which is where his dog, Demodocus, came from. I was like, okay, he needs a buddy, and it can't be a human buddy because the way the magic works is he's not allowed to touch anybody. And there's a law that says nobody's allowed to be within 5 feet of the king. So I did that for a couple reasons. One is just because it provides more conflict for Alessandra because she has to seduce this guy that she can't physically get close to. And the other one is that it kind of puts a barrier on him and letting himself be open to other people. So yeah, he's got his dog and he's got his strong will, and he's just trying to figure out what happened, and he's totally unprepared when Alessandra comes because he has no idea just how conniving she is and what her ultimate goals are. So that's kind of fun there. I don't want to get too much into his shadow magic just because I feel like it's something that's fun if you discover it as you read. But basically the idea is that he just can't touch anyone or bad things happen. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I feel like a lot of people call this a torturous slow burn romance, which I love. I think that's very accurate. And I think part of the reason is just that they can't touch. So I had to find other ways to create that tension, right? And that was lots of fun. I
appreciate a slow burn romance, though, that still moves with solid pacing, because I've read some slow burn romance, and I'm a 42-year-old dude, and it's like, and I read romance stuff. I love a solid romantic thing in a story, yeah. But slow burn tortured romances are quite torturous to me. And I've encountered a few very popular ones where I'm like, I don't know how anybody gets through them. Clearly, it's just a your mileage may vary kind of situation. So I was pleased to find that this one still kept its pacing up and didn't just didn't make the suffering last too long. Right?
I think it helps that it's a standalone, so there's got to be some kind of resolution.
Yes, I really like the aspect of, like you were talking about there, with Callias is keeping this person close to him because he has had attempts on his life and his parents were killed. And so he's trying to keep the one person he thinks will not try to kill him, yes. Which of course is the person who absolutely intends to kill him. But in turn, she has to try to make sure that nobody else kills him too early because she needs to keep him alive long enough to marry her and become queen, at which point then she can off him. So that is a pretty delicious situation to be stuck in there.
How my mind works.
Well, that's terrifying to know about you, but otherwise, great from a fiction standpoint.
Thank you.
Quickly, I want to touch on some of the supporting friends. You mentioned her two, newly found besties. There are also these
her gal pals.
Yeah. She also gets these 3 guy friends who are members of the court, who were childhood friends of Callias and who are now kind of pushed away along with everybody else. I had a terrific time in the novel anytime those characters were on screen, because
Aw.
the banter between them feels it's snappy and witty, but it feels like friends. It feels like real people who enjoy each other and also enjoy kind of taking the piss from each other a little bit as well.
Right.
I am interested to hear your thinking about those characters as you constructed them and where their place is in the novel.
Oh my goodness. So I also discovery write side characters. They just kind of appear when I need them to. And then I'm like, okay, now they need their own motivations and their own goals, right? So you have Leandros, who's like, I was the king's BFF and I'm not anymore because he pushed everyone away. And I just want to get back to being friends again, right? And then you've got poor Reuben, who's engaged to this horrible, nasty girl, and he just wants out of it. But his father will disinherit him if he tries, so he just can't, right? And then you have Petros, who is just loved by all the boys and the girls, and he just wants a meaningful relationship, but everybody's so fickle. So it was really fun to just kind of construct these guys who all have things that they want and they can't get them. And then you introduce Alessandra, who's like, I can make stuff happen. Let's just do this, right? And the idea behind it was that if she does favors for people, other people will owe her favors. So I needed people that she could rely on and use and then help them out in turn. And then those just kind of turned into their own friendships. And that's just kind of how I went about that. She's like, I need to meet people. I need to spread my resources and people need to owe me favors that I can call in later. And so that's basically what she does. She just uses them and she doesn't even realize that friendships are blooming.
One of my favorite scenes in the novel, and it's a really, I tend to get really attached to just character scenes over plot scenes in novels. And the one that really sticks out to me is there is kind of a social gathering. It's the coming out of a debutante. I believe it's the shooting star sequence, if that makes sense to call it that. And you have Alessandra in this space where the king is not with her, even though he is technically courting her. So she's kind of out in society by herself, which is kind of a weird spot to be in, because there are a number of men who are trying to grab her attention. But at the same time, at this party, nobody wants to dance with her because she is technically supposed to be in the king's arms. Yeah.
Yes.
There's a sequence with her and those three other gentleman friends where she seeds some of the goings-ons that will happen later. But we get that playful banter between them. We understand that you have the one guy who wants to get rid of his fiance and wants to be free of that situation. And Alessandra offers an opportunity to do that. And just, I don't know, everything about that sequence, it was one of those things where it painted the movie in my head where I could see those characters. I could see that going on. There's the moment where, is it Petros? Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, Petros.
Mm-hmm. Petros, kind of dances over with his person and trades off with the, trades the guy he's been dancing with off to his friend so that he can, get in with Alessandra there for a minute. And everything about their banter and the way it works and the other friend's awkwardness and then realization that the longer he was away, even dancing with another guy, he was away from the fiance he did not want to be with.
Yes.
And I delighted in that scene and I thought it worked really, really well. And so those kind of character moments are it's the spending time with people that you like kind of thing. And every time those people were on screen, so to speak, I was always happy. And I feel like I've been very, very wordy in this and I apologize, but you as a dialogue writer, you strike me as somebody who has almost kind of like a film sense of things. Do you do any kind of screenwriting? Is that something that you studied or play with? Because it feels like it.
I actually don't, but I would love to someday. I just love writing dialogue. It's my favorite. So my books just tend to be more dialogue heavy. I think the character interactions are what are the most fun for me in any book. So I tend to spend more time with that playful banter because it's what makes the writing enjoyable for me. But no, I don't have any background in screenwriting, but I would love to someday. I actually have some ideas that I'd love to do something with someday, but we'll see.
Well, I feel like this one would translate itself really well to screen. And, Netflix has seemed pretty keen on that stuff lately. So, maybe poke somebody.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. We talked that you aren't doing really outlining. Do you have a plotting method that you adhere to?
I do. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Dan Wells' 7-point plot system, but I use that a lot. And the idea is basically, I gave a little bit of it away, but you know the beginning and you know the end. And generally those are complete opposites of each other, right? You know where you want your character to start and where you want them to end up. And as the more different these 2 points are, the more interesting I feel like the journey is going to be. So once I know those 2 points, then I've got my middle climax, right? And then you have what are called the turning points in the novel. So where things are going normally, and then you have the inciting incident, right, which changes things. And you have these turning points in the novel. And once you hit those turning points, they kind of set the stage from your transition from beginning to middle and then middle to end. And I find that super helpful just because it always gives me a broad idea of where I'm going and those scenes that are going to help me transition into the next stage that I'm trying to go to. With The Shadows Between Us, the inciting incident happens really quick. It's basically on page like 1 or 2. It's basically, hey, your sister's finally engaged. You're going to the palace to meet the king, right? In Daughter of the Pirate King, it's also like the very first page. We're being invaded by pirates. You're finally going to be, a hostage, a pretend hostage on this ship kind of thing. And I like to write my books so that inciting incident happens as close to the beginning of the novel as possible, because I feel like that is what keeps the pacing going quickly and what moves you through the story. So yeah, once I know those, then I just start to do my chapter by chapter writing into those scenes. So I start with the 7-point plot system. And you can look that up. If you just go on YouTube and you look up Dan Wells' 7-point plot structure, his videos on that will come up, and there's sheets and things you can look at, but I find it super helpful. A lot of people I know like to use Save the Cat, but that's like so many different plots and so many different points to go through. And I need a little bit more freedom than that. So for me personally, I found that 7-point plot system works better. But obviously every writer's different, and it's all about just finding what works for you.
Absolutely.
So, and I don't even plot every book the same way. Obviously, like I said, with Shadows, I had to pants it, where the other books, I outline a lot more heavily. So even in book to book, you just have to do what kind of feels right.
Keeping all that stuff in mind, then, like, what are your tools of the trade? I mean, so we know your plotting method, we know you're pantsing it, but like, what do you write in? What software, like what analog stuff, what works for you?
I write in Scrivener, which I'm sure you've heard many authors talk about. I love it. It's designed for people actually doing big, long projects like books rather than Word, which is, good for papers and essays and things, but doesn't really think big. It just helps me to have my outline and everything else all in one space, easily accessible. It's so much easier to find things because each chapter is almost like its own little document off to the side. It's easy to switch things around, and especially when I'm editing, oh my gosh, it makes it so much easier. So yeah, I swear by Scrivener. And I'm probably only using like 10% of what the program can do. So once I actually become like really good at it, I'm sure things will be even better. But I love Scrivener.
A lot of people get intimidated by Scrivener. I'm a Scrivener user, and I love it. But I think you make a good point there, is that like I think most people with any software program they use, they're really only using like 10% of what that thing can actually do, unless it's just like super simplified. I mean, even if you're in Word or like, and there's like all kinds of functions in there that you would never touch on a normal basis. So I think when people like start to use it and get really intimidated, I'm like, I don't feel like you need to use every single bit of this thing. Like just the organizational factor in it alone is absolutely wonderful. Particularly if you're the kind of person who rewrites things or moves them around, or, I mean, clearly everybody's rewriting it if they're an author, but if sometimes you have a section where like, oh, this might have made sense earlier in the plot or something like that. And you can literally just kind of pick it up and move it rather than having like a 700-page Word document.
You're like, where was that scene again? But you're like, no, it's clearly marked off on the side. I know exactly where that scene is, instead of scrolling through 300, 400 pages of Word.
And then just last thing, before we wrap up, I want to know just what other media are you feeding your writer brain with? What are you reading? What are you watching? What in particular is striking your fancy?
So I read a lot of YA fantasy, believe it or not. I'm a big believer in reading what you write and making sure that your stuff is different. And you don't know that unless you're reading heavily in your genre. Not that everything I'm doing is brand new or anything. We've already talked about like the tropes and things that I like to use. But I feel like if you have a good sense of what's out there, your writing's going to be better for it. So I read a lot of YA fantasy. I also love adult fantasy and science fiction. I recently read Gideon the Knight, which was a sheer delight. I don't know if you've read that one, but it's fabulous and I highly recommend it. You don't know what's going on 10% of the time, but it's okay. You're okay with it because
I was at a good 50%, but yeah.
Oh, but it was just so good. I'm also a big gamer. I love video games. I'm obsessed with Overwatch. I actually use that a little bit with strategizing, when people are in battle. I could go on about Overwatch for a while. But I really love Overwatch. Recently, my newest obsession has become Sea of Thieves, which is where I get to be a literal pirate on the internet. And it's just like the best thing ever. You're digging for treasure, following treasure maps. You're pirating other ships. Like it's just amazing. And I could could spend all day on that if I didn't have books to write. So yeah, I love that. I highly recommend The Last Kingdom if anyone has not seen that. It's a Netflix original. It's a Viking story about Uhtred, son of Uhtred, and it's amazing. So that one was fabulous, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah, anything with like a historical setting, a little bit of magic, I'm all over for it. I read some and watch some contemporary too, but it just doesn't speak to me as much as fantasy and old timey settings do. So I'm hungry for it everywhere. Oh, I'm currently reading The Fell of Dark by Caleb Rarig, which is a male vampire story, and it's great. It's so great. He is fabulous and writes YA thrillers, and I highly recommend them. Oh, I recently finished The Queen of Nothing, which is the last book in Holly Black's Captive Prince. Nope, Cruel Prince. Sorry, Captive Prince is a different story. Cruel Prince series, which is very, very good. If you like kind of darker romances, I also recommend Holly Black's The Cruel Prince. I also recommend Captive Prince, but that's for an entirely different audience. So anyway, yeah, that's a male adult romance. It's very, very good, but it's definitely for older audiences.
Mature audiences suggested.
Mature audiences only for Captive Prince.
And then where should people be following you online to keep up with the current slate, the new things that are coming out, new announcements, all that kinds of stuff?
Yeah, I'm most active on Instagram. So everything on my account is under my name, Tricia Levenseller. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook. The best way to if you only want to stay up to date on news is to just follow my blog. I post there maybe once or twice a year, but I only post what new books I've got coming out or what's up and coming. So if you just want to know facts, be there. If you want to hear I'm having a bad writing day or whatever, follow me on Instagram and you'll get all that too.
Like I said at the top, The Shadows Between Us is available now in stores and all fine booksellers online and not. Like I said, there's also a number of other books in your back catalog that people should go and check out. Again, I think this book is a lot of fun. I think this is a really interesting POV character and just a lot of fun characterizations. Like I said, devious, and funny and intriguing and twisty and good stuff all the way around.
Thank you.
So yeah, like I said, go pick up The Shadows Between Us now. And Tricia, thank you for joining me on Fictitious.
Thanks for having me.
This has been Season 5, Episode 3 of Fictitious. As I record this, we're currently practicing social distancing and shelter-in-place protocols during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm fortunate that I work from home and record from my home studio. I hope you're also doing whatever you can to help slow the spread of this illness, but if you're in a position where you still have to go to work doing one of the many essential jobs that keep store shelves stocked, utilities turned on, and supply lines moving, I want to say that I appreciate your hard work and hope that the episodes of this show provide some amount of comfort and entertainment. Sequestered here in my home, I've finally gotten around to do something that's been suggested to me time and again, which is to set up ways that you can help support me in making Fictitious. This show is a labor of love, but it also takes significant time to create and monthly expenses to maintain. If you're in a position where you can contribute to the continued production and growth of this podcast, there are now 2 ways to do so, either by becoming a monthly supporter on Patreon or with one-time donations using Ko-Fi. Patreon subscribers will receive patron-exclusive content, including text and video blogs, transcribed versions of new interviews with additional commentary from me, and shoutouts to new patrons here in the outros of each episode. To join, go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Patreon and choose a membership tier that works for you. If you'd like to show your support with a one-time donation, you can buy me a coffee using Ko-Fi. It's super easy and fast, and every bit of help is very much appreciated. Go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Ko-Fi to get started, and that's K-O-F-I, one word, no hyphen. I know times are tight. Even if Patreon and Ko-Fi aren't an option for you, you can still help the show by sharing your favorite episodes on your social profiles, tell all your book-loving friends, or write a review. All of that supports the authors who appear on the program and helps me to grow the podcast. As always, you can listen and subscribe to Fictitious on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or search for the show using your favorite podcasting app. Every episode of the show is also available at fictitiouspodcast.com, along with news and events, articles, and more. You'll find the show on Twitter and Instagram as @FictitiouSpod, or you can chat with me directly on my personal account @AdrianBusky. My next interview will feature the return of author Dan Stout. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.